He pointed at the iron gate as if it were a crown. His small fist trembled with the kind of certainty that belongs to children who have learned early to stand for themselves. "This house is mine," Miguel shouted, and the words hung in the manicured air like a dropped coin that no one knew how to pick up politely. For a moment, everything stopped. The silverware paused in the hands of people who did not know how to listen to a street voice. The chandelier seemed to tilt toward the boy as if curious, and the young man beside the mahogany table, dressed like every arrogance stitched into his suit, let out a laugh loud enough to invite the whole room to join him. Roberto Almeida laughed first. The laugh had a shape, quick, dismissive, the kind that lives on the back of privilege and lands on other people's lives like a boot. Heads turned. Some smiled politely. Others, those whose smiles were worn thin, shifted uneasily. Lords, who had been pushing her cleaning cart along the corridor, tightened her jaw until the cloth in her hand felt like an anchor, her knuckles whiter than the linen. The room swelled with a dozen sentences nobody spoke. Where did that child come from? Let him be. It's a shame, really. A couple of phones recorded. A woman clicked her tongue. Miguel's voice did not tremble. He did not shout to be cruel or to be seen. He shouted from a place he had rehearsed in the dark hours of the library, an assertion that was at once an offering and a demand. He did not yet understand the machinery his words had turned on. He only knew the house had been the shape of stories he had learned from his mother. The scent of lemon on the porch, the sound of laughter in rooms he had never entered, the way his name had been spoken once and then folded into silence. To him, the house was a knot in his own history, a horizon he could almost touch if someone would only stop telling him he had no right to try. After the laughter, a ripple of conversation swelled into a directed current. Roberto's smile sharpened into something practiced. Patricia Guzmao from Human Resources cleared her throat as if she were rearranging a timeline where this incident would not exist. Security moved like a shadow, careful, bureaucratic, and Lourdes, eyes steady but small, stepped between her son and the world that wanted to make him disappear. A flash of memory, quick and precise, cut the scene. Miguel, under the fluorescent glare of the public library, counting down the last 2 minutes of his 15-minute internet session. The clock, a small rectangle on the shared screen, blinked impatiently. Miguel's fingers flew over keys, pulling up old maps, scribbling names in a battered notebook. The paper was full of arrows, ink smudged where his thumb had swept over a name and refused to let go. He was learning to read the edges of things people thought were finished. If anyone had told him that day, when he raised his voice in the corridor while his mother folded towels at the back of the estate, that the world would turn toward him with knives and with help, he would have been surprised. He had been taught by Lourdes to expect hard work, not heroics. She had taught him to wipe tables until they shone and to keep his eyes on his notebooks until the letters made rooms of their own. If this story is talking to you, stay with it. There is more coming that will make the laughter feel smaller. They walked home the half hour between the estate and their building like a pair of seasons moving together. Lourdes in the lead, the cart scraping a familiar rhythm, Miguel clutching his worn notebooks like talismans. People on the sidewalk looked away. A child from school crossed the street to avoid him. The world was already deciding, in small bended ways, who Miguel would be allowed to be. Lourdes's life was not a single hardship. It was a careful geometry of dignity. She ironed the collars of executives who never asked her name, hummed old songs to herself between rooms, and washed dishes with the proud economy of someone who knew her labor had worth, even if others called it invisible. She had migrated years ago, carrying her own mother's stories in the folds of a suitcase. She had won small battles, an extra hour off on her birthday, the neighborhood grocer who never charged her for oranges, and lost some too. There were nights she could not afford the medicine the building recommended. There were mornings she woke with the ache of work in her bones that no prayer could straighten. Miguel was the best of her defense, not because he was ruthless, he was not, but because he listened the way a person can when life's edges have been sharpened by poverty into focus. At night, he would spread his notebooks on the single bare chair and read aloud to himself the things adults had told him were not for boys like him. He copied diagrams, solved problems backwards, and practiced names of things he planned to claim when the world let him speak without interruption. He taught himself geometry from hand-me-down math books, vocabulary from public library magazines, and patience from the way his mother slept for only 3 hours sometimes and woke smiling. The first days after the shouting were small and total. Lourdes was called into Patricia's office. The conversation was all softness wrapped around steel. "You understand, Lourdes," Patricia said, voice lubricated with the civility of a woman who keeps rules for the powerful. "This company cannot be associated with disturbances. Your contract—" She slid a printed page across the desk that defined terms and had the firmness of a noose. Lourdes signed, not because she had to, though she did, but because she had a son to bring home. Miguel watched from the doorway, his notebook on his lap like a shield. At school, the days got longer. Classmates who had once shared snacks now stepped back, and teachers who had once smiled drew their chairs away. Children can be cruel without wanting to be, repeating a parent's snicker or a neighbor's soft word that they do things differently. Miguel learned to keep his head down. He kept writing. But pity is a poor ally of justice. For every whisper that tried to erase them, curiosity arrived in the form of a man who had learned to watch how other people see. Khalil al-Mansour had the sort of wealth that built schools with his name on the wall. But he also had a habit of not pretending he knew everything. He attended the luncheon that day because corporate family foundations like his were meant to be on the guest list. More quietly, he attended because he liked to see how people moved when they thought the cameras were off. Khalil watched Miguel for 2 reasons. The first was obvious. The boy's mouth had lodged in his mind like an image that did not belong to the setting. An unpolished, stubborn human sound in a room designed for polite echoes. The second reason was smaller and stranger, the way Miguel listened. When Khalil passed him near the end of the luncheon, a brief, accidental exchange where Miguel offered the magnate a folded page of his notes as if it were a gift, Khalil saw handwriting that had the rhythm of someone who studied hard and made sense of the world in his own order. It is a small quality to others, but to men like Khalil, it is a signal. Later that week, Khalil sent a note through the correct channels. Find the boy. Carlos Henrique, his assistant, took it as an assignment, but he treated it like a favor. Carlos had been in rooms where privilege used paper to carve reputations. He had learned that paper can also hold a truth if someone knows how to read between the printed lines. He began quietly. Carlos's investigation moved like a small tide. He visited the municipal archive in the afternoons when the clerks had gone to lunch and the dust motes settled like a congregation of quiet witnesses. He fingered through registries, yellowed pages, names stacked like family histories, and discovered things that pricked his curiosity. A ledger from decades ago marked a property transfer not fully explained, an entry in the estate's old guest book, a name in looping script with a familiar surname, a penciled note next to a baptism record with a caretaker's name that matched a surname Lourdes had once mentioned in passing. He took photographs with a small, polite camera and logged every page. He copied the handwriting into his notes. Nothing immediate leapt out like a headline. Instead, there were friction points, footprints in the dust, small inconsistencies that together shaped a possibility. Someone had wanted the record to be tidy, but tidy had never equaled truth. While Carlos followed paperwork, Marcia, Miguel's history teacher, became an uncommissioned advocate. She had watched Miguel sit at the back row, chin on fist, and understood the look of someone living in translation, listening to the world's language without being given the chance to answer. She began to gather testimonials from neighbors, teachers, and librarians, the names of older women who remembered a girl who once worked in the estate, the recollection of a photograph in the library archive showing staff at a summer reception where a young woman with a certain profile stood reservedly beside a man whose face resembled, faintly, Miguel's. Memory is slippery, but people will risk their anonymity when something feels unjust. Marcia's list grew. Meanwhile, Roberto had his own response. He organized smiles and conversations like a general marshal's troops. Patricia double-checked timestamps on incident reports, security reviewed footage with surgical attention, and murmurs were cultivated. The quiet suggestion that Miguel's shout was an attention-seeking stunt, a symptom of a mother's poor judgment. Roberto's motive was not only to protect the reputation of his family's house, it was a preservation reflex of status. If anyone suggested that blood, not papers, might complicate the tidy family story, he would meet that suggestion with a cascade of polished denials. The smear campaign did not need to be loud to work. It tapped into assumptions already wired into people. The idea that a maid's son could not simply be an heir, that certain houses can only belong to certain names. The campaign was quieter than a televised accusation. It lived in suggested comments and veiled threats about job security. Rumors spread to creditors and to school administrators. A file was opened in the HR office. Lourdes received a letter. She read it alone in the bathroom of her apartment, pressed the paper to her chest as if it might oxygenate her. Miguel found her there, and they held one another without words, because the silence between them had always been a language of survival. At the same time, Carlos and Khalil found small, stubborn things that made them press further. Carlos discovered an old maintenance log, that inventory of linens and menus too mundane for anyone to notice, where a name had been inadvertently abbreviated in the margin. That same abbreviation matched the way a priest in a church registry had spelled a name 40 years ago. The alignment of 3 or 4 minor records did not prove anything in a courtroom, but it indexed possibility. It suggested a thread someone might pull at without knowing whether the fabric would come apart or reveal a hidden seam. Khalil was not a man to rush. He preferred to gather a constellation of facts until an outline emerged. But he also recognized the danger of delay. Each afternoon that Miguel went to school and each hour Lourdes kept her head down to finish her shift, the smear did its work. He arranged small, practical things first. A legal advisor who could explain in plain language what it would mean to pursue an inquiry without exposing Lourdes to more risk. A discreet contact at a forensic lab who would outline the process of kinship testing without starting a public fire. And Carlos, who became both hunter and guardian of the scattered papers. Alongside the official moves, the neighborhood murmured. Juliana, a girl from Miguel's block who used to call him names, found herself stopped by the sight of him stacking his notebooks on a crate outside the library. She had never seen anyone write with such concentration. People noticed him giving geometry lessons to neighborhood kids on weekends, drawing triangles on discarded cardboard. Little things began to shape a new portrait. Miguel as persistent, patient, a small man learning the design of life with the crude tools available to him. On a rainy Thursday, after one of Lourdes' shifts, Khalil came to the building not with cameras or statements, but with a thermos of coffee and an honest invitation. He had seen the way Miguel folded the pages of his notebook, and he had seen the way Lourdes watched her son as though he were the fragile center of an otherwise unlit room. He said plainly, "I think there is something worth checking." He explained that checking did not have to mean spectacle. It could be careful, private, and aimed at restoring what seemed lost. He spoke without pretense. Lourdes listened the way she always did when someone used words that honored rather than excused. The idea of a test, something as modern and clinical as DNA, felt to Lourdes both foreign and heavy. Her life had been one of hands, of scrubbing, of stove heat, and the wet smell of linens on hot days. Science lived in television shows where justice existed in neat sentences. Here, in her kitchen with a thermos and a man who could buy 10 of the buildings around her and not notice them, the word DNA sounded like a tool and like a promise. It sounded like risk. It sounded like the exacting gaze of the world. Miguel, who had been folding the thermos cap back into place, looked at the ceiling as if it had answers. "If my name is there," he said, "then it's not just paper, it's truth." His voice was not full of triumph, but rather a coming to terms. What he wanted most was not the house as a prize, but the right to be seen on his own terms. The house, to him, was a symbol, a way to say his history was not a rumor. Khalil explained the process in the smallest possible steps, staying away from the dramatics he could have afforded. "We can do it quietly," he said. "We get a sample from you, one from the family, if they're willing, or from other records. The lab runs the markers. They give us a report. It either aligns or it doesn't. If it does, then we can move forward with the facts. If it doesn't, then we walk away knowing we tried. But it has to be done properly. Chain of custody, signed forms, licensed lab. No shortcuts." Lourdes asked a question that landed like a pebble in still water. "And if they use it to hurt us?" Hurt, in her voice, was not a hypothetical. It was a ledger of past harms. Khalil did not pretend the world was kind. He said, "There is risk. There is also the possibility that truth will cut the ground from the people who tried to bury it. We will be careful." That was the turning point that would, later, allow for a legal process and public revelation. But at this moment, the decision felt like a private knife. Miguel and Lourdes discussed it long into the night, whispering over old lamps and shared cups of boiled coffee. They spoke about the shame of being disbelieved and about the shame of making accusations. They spoke about the life they wanted to leave behind, not one of grievance, but one of stability and dignity. Meanwhile, Roberto was ensuring the world would not let go. He arranged a public interview in a business magazine where he described the incident as an unfortunate outburst and praised the estate's history of offering opportunities to workers. He talked about respectability and about the responsibility of maintaining a family's legacy. He smiled the smile of someone who knows how to frame his narrative early. He knew optics and how to outpace a messy truth with an even messier half-truth dressed as goodwill. But narratives can only hold if no one else offers a different script. The small facts Carlos had found, an old ledger mark, a smudged baptismal note, a name repeated in a guest book, did not look like a revolution on their own. They were raw, messy, the kind of things that could be dismissed by lawyers with faster pens than the truths those documents suggested. Yet they were enough to give Khalil and Carlos a reason to persist. Patricia continued to perform HR's choreography, neutral, unbothered, efficient. Her memos were impeccable. Her calendar filled with polite meetings meant to sponge away any disruption. But in the corners where corporate machinery never sees, some employees whispered among themselves, discomfort trailing after them like a second shadow. A security guard who had been at the estate for 20 years remembered a woman with a child in a faded photograph stuck behind a frame by the office door. The photograph had always been there. He had never thought to ask. Memory, when it begins to gather, seeks company. In public, Miguel's declaration remained a soundbite that could be used as a joke by those who wanted to make him small. In private, it grew like a root. People who had known small things about his mother and about the estate started to gather them like stones for a path. Marcia brought forward testimonies from neighbors and teachers. The librarian, a thin woman with ink on her fingers, lent her time and opened a file box where old papers slept. Carlos brought photocopies of registry entries. Khalil offered discreet funding for a legal review. It was a coalition of the careful. As the coalition formed, though, the personal pressures grew. Lourdes received late-night calls from past employers asking probing questions. Her sister was offered money in exchange for silence. Miguel was cornered by a boy in the schoolyard who said, "You sure you're not just trying to trick people?" and then proceeded to shove him. Miguel's notebooks were ridiculed in class until Marcia stepped in and made them a display. "This is the mind of a young man who has not been given much, but has given everything," she told them, and the class fell quieter for a week. There was a moment, in the middle of all these small wars, where Miguel sat on the library steps and watched rain blur the world. He had always liked rain for the way it made the city smell honest. He opened a page and rewrote an equation until it made a different kind of sense. He had friends, small, loyal people who shared cigarettes behind the bakery and taught him card tricks. He did not always feel brave. He felt often only the shape of duty. But he had a stubbornness that was not bitter. It was simply the decision to exist fully. A week after Khalil's visit, Carlos walked into Lourdes' kitchen with 3 plain envelopes. He explained carefully that he had found a small trail. "Not proof," he said, "but a trail." He put the envelopes on the table like a set of seeds. Inside were photocopies, one of a registry page where a signature resembled the way Lourdes wrote her name, though different by years, one of a photograph where a figure in the background might have been a young maid, and one of a maintenance ledger with an abbreviation that matched a church record. Carlos did not frame these as indictments. He presented them as invitations to pursue a question. Lourdes touched the edges of the papers with the same care she used on linens. In the soft kitchen light, the papers looked fragile and heavy at once. "Why now?" she asked. "Why look?" Carlos answered not with rhetoric, but with the simple language of possibility. Because sometimes the truth needs someone to ask for it. His words did not sweep away fear. There were concerns about exposing old wounds that some would rather see remain closed. There were also worries about how the community would react if a public struggle unfolded. Khalil had warned them, "Once you start asking, the world will watch." But he had also promised to shield them from unnecessary exposure. He had networks. He had lawyers. He had, most importantly in Lourdes' estimation, patience. They planned carefully. They agreed that the next move would not be public. They would not storm a press conference. They would collect the facts, place them in order, and then decide if the truth that might emerge would be worth the possible cost. At one point, Miguel, who understood courage in a way that was both childlike and unbreakable, said, "If it's my blood, I want to know. If it's not, we'll still be clean." The clarity in his voice moved Lourdes to a tear she swallowed fast. She was not sentimental in public, but the risk had entered her like cold water. By the time the decision to test came into focus, there was already a quiet plan. Khalil had arranged for a forensic lab known for discretion and accuracy. Carlos had made appointments with witnesses and had matched dates on old documents. Marcia had prepared letters of testimony. A lawyer had drawn up forms that would hold chain of custody protocols, simple, clear lines in a document that would say who collected what and when. The legal forms were meant to protect the sample from accusation of tampering. They made the whole idea feel less like a leap and more like a careful step. Before any swab was taken, however, there was one more current pulling against them. Roberto, sensing a tightening knot, started to look outward for allies. He called in favors. He whispered to people who could make the story look messy and to journalists who liked scandal. A rumor about Lourdes' past was planted in a small local paper, an old complaint about a minor theft in a market, years ago, that had ended without charge, but could be made to look like a pattern. It was a low trick meant to pry at the stitches of dignity. The community reacted predictably and painfully. Some people drew back from Lourdes as if contagion might rub off. Others came forward. The librarians organized a small meeting in the back room and handed Miguel a stack of books with notes in the margins. "Keep writing," they said. Marcia wrote a letter to the principal that read simply, "Do not let a child become guilty of his parents' lack of wealth." On the evening the samples were arranged to be taken, Lourdes and Miguel sat on the small balcony of their apartment and watched lights burn in the block opposite. For Lourdes, the lights were a geography of choices made daily and quietly. The neighbor who mended shoes, the woman who taught embroidery to kids after school, the man who sold fruit from a stall and smiled at them as if they were more than passing shadows. She thought about dignity in the way she thought about linen. Treat it with care, and it returns its shape, even when it had been crumpled. Miguel squeezed her hand. "Whatever happens," he said, "we've already started something." There was no swagger in his sentence. There was only an ache of responsibility. "If this is about a house," he added, "it's also about what comes after. The kids in my street who deserve a room that smells like books, not bleach." His vision was not revenge. It was repair. Carlos arrived with the protective kit the lab required: sealed envelopes, sterile swabs, and an affidavit. Khalil had arranged for a legal observer to sign the chain of custody forms. The procedure, explained simply, was this: a sample would be collected from Miguel and from whoever the family allowed to be tested as a possible relative. Each sample would be sealed, labeled, and signed for. Then the samples would be sent directly to the lab in a secure envelope. The lab would analyze the genetic markers and match the patterns. If the markers aligned, they would indicate kinship. If not, they would not. Lourdes felt both the creep of fear and a fierce uplift of righteousness. She understood what the test could do. It could restore the thread that had been cut, or it could deliver a finalness that left them bruised but still standing. She had always taught Miguel to sweep not only floors, but the crumbs of despair that others left behind. Now it was as if they were sweeping toward a door they had not dared to knock upon. But right at the moment when the first swab touched a cheek, and the room holding their small circle held its breath in the legal silence of paperwork and sealing, a new note arrived. An email, anonymous, forwarded to Khalil's assistant. A photo of the estate's family ledger, freshly photographed, with a page torn away where a likely name had been. Roberto's people were fast. They had the resources to manipulate how a story looked. They could create confusion. They could drag the process into a court of public opinion before the lab could return a single line. Khalil folded the phone in his palm, his jaw tightening not in anger, but in an accountant's annoyance at inefficiency. "Stay calm," he said, though everyone could feel the tension like a wire. "We move forward. We let the facts do the talking." Lourdes watched the sealed envelope in Carlos's hand. It had the gravity of a small, heavy thing. A paper that could not be altered without leaving a mark. She thought of all the times she had held evidence of her own life, receipts, names, a child's birth certificate, and how each had been a step toward being visible. "Do it," she said, and her voice was steady. Miguel nodded as if he were signing his own name inside his head. They did not understand then how the declaration that had seemed like a child's spirited claim would force the world to consider versions of itself it had not wanted to hold. They only knew that they were choosing to be seen. For Lourdes, being seen had always been a dangerous luxury. For Miguel, it was the beginning of an argument he did not yet have the words to make. Outside, night pressed close like a question. Inside, the envelope waited under a lamp in a small office where the forms would be signed, stamped, and sent. The decision had been made to pursue truth in a way that would later demand more than they had bargained for. The small coalition of ordinary people around them, teachers, a librarian, a discreet billionaire who liked to do things right, prepared to stand witness. At the moment the envelope was sealed, Miguel remembered the corridor where he first shouted. He remembered the laughing man and the pause that had followed it. He remembered that laughter because it had been an occasion for choosing, either to shrink or to proceed. He chose then and there to proceed. The night deepened, loaded with the weight of procedure and possibility. The hum of the city was a distant machine of lives continuing whether this family was vindicated or not. Lourdes lay awake, thinking of the house not as a prize, but as a place where a child could have a desk and a shelf of his own, where a mother could rest without counting the cost of another unfair morning. Miguel slept with his notebooks tucked into his pillow like a promise. The next morning, the sealed package would go to the lab. Men like Roberto would marshal their narratives. The neighborhood would brace for the spill of news, for the rumor swamp to boil. Allies would tighten their grip. The court of public opinion would start to listen to the way a story was framed. But in the small room where they had signed the forms and breathed together, the sound was quiet and simple. The scratch of pen, the rustle of paper, the sound of two people making a claim not for a house, but for the right to have their truth count. Outside the window, the estate glowed like a reserved jewel. Inside that glow was a family who believed they had a right to belong. The laughter that had once ridiculed them seemed, in the memory, both small and huge. Small for its cruelty, huge because it had pushed the boy to ask for his name to be spoken aloud. The rest, the long, complicated rest, investigations, legal maneuvers, public exposure, had yet to arrive in its full force. They moved into the day aware that their choice to test would not be neat, it would not be quick. It would open doors that some would prefer to stay closed and would close other doors with a finality they could not predict. But they had taken the first step. They had declared that the truth, however messy, was worth pursuing. And while the envelope waited in the lab's secure mailbox, a quiet alliance of small things continued to accumulate. A teacher's testimony, a librarian's photocopies, a photograph that had been misfiled. Each acted like a hand on a rope, pulling a truth that had been buried toward light. The world was not kind to those who insist on being seen, but it had a curious way of bowing to persistence. There was no grand fanfare when the sealed envelope left the office. A driver took it in a plain case, along streets now learning the pattern of rumor and curiosity. Miguel watched the taillights until they vanished into the lane. He did not cry. He only felt, beneath his ribs, a steady pulse of something like hope. And somewhere in a room where men in suits adjusted their collars and women in neat blouses rehearsed phrases, a young heir paced, already rehearsing the lines he would deliver if the world threatened the neatness of his family's narrative. He had laughed once. He did not realize how the echo of that laugh would follow him into moments he wished to keep private. The decision had been taken. The shape of confrontation was forming. The first parts of the story, the shout, the laughter, the humiliations, had been written into people's memories. Now the written words on official paper would have to answer to the science of blood and to the stubborn human work of testimony and time. At the edge of the day, as shadows lengthened, Miguel sat at the very gate of his building and traced letters on the soot-dark wall. He wrote "home" as if it were a map, and then he underlined the word twice. He thought of a house as not only walls and roof, but as belonging, recognition, a place where one's name is not a rumor. He had shouted for that place, and now the world was beginning to listen in the only language that may yet decide: facts. The sealed package moved through the city like a small, sure rumor. It passed from the courier to the lab receptionist, was signed for in a neat book, and slid into a cooler with a professionalism that felt almost ceremonial. For Miguel and Lourdes, those small official acts were the nearest thing to a promise the world could give, formal, recorded, impossible to erase without leaving a fingerprint. Days stretched thin. Roberto's smear had found a new life on social feeds and in the whispered corridors of suppliers and school parents. A columnist who specialized in the petty cruelty of local scandals wrote a piece insinuating instability in Lourdes's past. A television host used Miguel's shout as a punchline in a segment about attention-seeking stunts. The hurt of it was not the words themselves as much as the way they built a fence around the boy, making it harder for adults who wanted to help to reach him without stepping over etiquette built to protect the comfortable. Khalil sat in a small office that smelled faintly of coffee and newspaper glue and watched the feeds that others preferred to ignore. He had paid for discretion, and he got it. Most of what he saw were polite denials and pundits searching for entertainment. But he also found a kind of public hunger, a handful of people who became, in the watching, a conscience. These were the librarians, the teachers, and a few journalists who had once written more intimate portraits of city life. He kept them close without making noise. He made calls on the quiet, lawyers, media managers who understood fairness, a lab director who had never lost a case in his career. He knew the power of attention, and he wanted it used like a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. Carlos, meanwhile, moved through archives like someone following a scent. He found a photograph, in a forgotten municipal file, an image of a summer fair at the estate, stamped with the year. At the edge of the frame, A young woman with a careful face and a woven pin at her collar stood beside the patriarch. She was in the background, largely unnoticed, but when Carlos blew the image up and compared cheekbones and the slope of a jaw, the resemblance to Miguel, though not definitive to a layman, had a stubborn, human clarity. The ledger page that had been torn, an awkward, inexplicable absence, hung over them like a question. Carlos found evidence that an archivist decades earlier had transcribed a name into a different ledger when he had been sent to make room on a shelf. He found a marginal note in a parish register that read like a hurried addition. Not a smoking gun, almost never, but enough to demand more. The lab, a gray building that smelled of cleaning solvent and quiet competence, called one afternoon in the third week. The voice at the other end was careful, as if someone were reading a delicate instrument. "We have initial markers consistent with a first-degree kinship," the technician said. It was not a pronouncement. No one in the room with the line could say that it meant what Lourdes wanted. The word consistent is a precarious kind of hope, meaning maybe and not meaning yet, but it sent a current through them all. Khalil instructed Carlos to arrange a second independent test at another lab. "We defend the result before we present it," he said. "2 labs, 2 chains of custody, no opening for a scandal built on procedure." The second lab agreed. Its director came with credentials and a grave dislike of sloppy evidence. He explained in plain terms how a sample moved from cheek to machine to report, and he allowed Lourdes to place a final signature on the chain of custody form herself. It was something small and profound, a mother's name written on a page that would later mean something like belonging. Roberto's reaction evolved from practiced laughter to frantic containment. He hired a reputation management firm that tried to pin the story on opportunists and thieves of attention. He called in favors with lawyers who suggested private settlements to those he thought vulnerable. Patricia filed more memos that suggested Lourdes had been given every opportunity and that the company had been generous. It was an effort to make politics look like policy. But there are limits to spin when the facts begin to gain a voice. Marcia's testimony arrived with children's handwriting and dates. The librarian brought photocopies with notes and a photograph of a small welcome ceremony on the estate, where a woman in a maid's uniform, smiling without fanfare, stood beside a man whose profile, when viewed with imagination, could be Miguel's. The security guard found, in an old photocopy tucked away under a filing cabinet, a name that matched a baptismal entry Carlos had found. Each piece, small and imperfect on its own, began to knit. The anonymous emails and the rumor mill kept pushing. A man who ran a local forum started a thread with the title, "Truth About the Maid's Son," where subscribers argued and shouted. Some were cruel. Others, in quieter tones, posted memories of small kindnesses Miguel's mother had shown them. How Lourdes had once helped an elderly neighbor cross the street. How she had given a child's sweater to a child who needed it. The thread became a kind of raw ledger of human recollection. There were nights when Lourdes would not speak of the lab or the ledger when Miguel was present. She would sit by the sink and fold tea towels with a concentration that looked almost like prayer. Sometimes she would hum the same song her mother had sung, the one about crossing rivers, and Miguel would listen like a disciple. He slept poorly. The waiting had the taste of iron. Then, when all things seemed most brittle, the problem they feared most arrived, an attempt to manipulate the narrative from within. A man who worked in building maintenance, who had been loyal to the estate for 30 years, appeared at Khalil's door and said he had been offered money to remember things differently. He had a recording of the conversation. The voice on the tape, smooth as oil, suggested a rewriting of memory for a fee. That was the first time Khalil felt something like fury rise in him, not because of the money, but because of the presumption that human memory could be purchased and sold. It was time, the small coalition decided. They could not wait indefinitely. The smear would calcify into opinion. They called a meeting in a rehearsal hall owned by Khalil's foundation, neutral, bright, with a stage and rows of chairs. The kind of room that made plain people feel important merely by being invited onto its floor. He invited a handful of journalists he trusted, the lab directors, Marcia, the librarian, the maintenance man with the recorded conversation, and a lawyer who had agreed to ensure everything was airtight. The press pack that arrived were not exactly paparazzi. They were people who covered local affairs and had a streak of investigative curiosity. They sat, and their devices hummed. They expected drama. They did not expect the quiet dignity that opened the event. Khalil began without flourish. He told the story in the order of its facts. A boy shouted in a corridor, a laugh echoed, files and rumors tried to bury a possibility, and a team of ordinary people had done the patient work of asking questions. He spoke of chain of custody and of 2 independent laboratories. He spoke of the legal forms lords had signed. He placed on stage the photocopies, the ledger excerpts, the picture from the municipal archive. He let them be seen. Then Miguel was invited forward. He walked with a small, measured confidence that had nothing to do with bravado and everything to do with a responsibility the boy had chosen. He handed a folded sheet to the lab director. "This is mine," he said simply. The lab director read the report aloud. The words were clinical, and yet, in the room, they had the warmth of a verdict. The combined analysis shows a high probability of first-degree biological relationship. The lab director explained what that meant without ceremony. The markers were consistent in a way that strongly indicated kinship. He let the language be precise enough to be credible and plain enough for everyone to understand. This was not an opinion. It was a finding based on recognized methodology. The sound in the room shifted. It was as if air had been rearranged. Some listeners made the motions of acceptance as if responding to instructions. Others simply breathed out. Carlos, had the expression of someone who had been part of a slow, difficult rescue. But facts alone rarely overturn a narrative. It was one thing to be proven biologically related. It was another to connect that biological link to property and family recognition. Khalil had prepared for that too. He had laboriously compiled the documentary trail that, when placed alongside the DNA mapping, suggested an acknowledgement the family had made informally for years. Private notes, a ledger entry that had once registered a birth under a caretaker's name. A series of receipts that showed the household had been providing support to a young family in the years after the patriarch's health declined. As the director read the lab letter, Marcia stepped forward with her stack of testimonials. She read, in a voice that did not shy from tenderness, of a young woman who once worked on the estate, the care she took, the way the patriarch would sometimes, discreetly, in small kindnesses, help with schooling costs. The librarian placed the photograph under the bright light and spoke gently of the image of a woman whose posture suggested a quiet familiarity with the house. The security guard handed his copy of a photocopied ledger to the lawyer, who pointed out the gap in the records where a page had been removed. Finally, Carlos played the recording of the maintenance man's attempted inducement and then, with the lawyer's permission, read select emails that indicated there had been conversations. Private, hurried, that showed concern within the estate for what the revelation of a blood connection might mean. Those emails had no smoking gun accusation. They were bureaucratic, but they showed attention, and attention can act like a mirror. When people are forced to look at themselves on the page, their faces do not always look like the ones they had practiced in the mirror. A microphone caught every moment. The journalists typed, cameras filmed. After the formal presentation, Khalil closed with the simplest possible observation. We have documents. We have testimony. We have scientific findings that demand recognition. It is not for us to mete out punishment. It is for us to restore what a family or a system may have quietly stolen. He looked at Miguel and Lourdes, and then at the journalists. We will hand everything to the appropriate authorities, and we will ask that the estate's board convene to decide on restitution. But whether through legal means or through the decency of those who hold power, this boy's assertion deserves to be met by the facts. The estate produced a statement the next morning. It was long and careful. It said that the family would review the findings and that they acknowledge the pain caused by speculation. Roberto released a statement of his own that praised due process and respect for privacy and called for a measured response. Patricia issued a memo indicating that the company would cooperate fully. The net result, in practice, was delay, the kind of procedural white space lawyers love. But the delay was less fearsome now. The facts had a momentum. Roberto tried a final gambit. He arranged a press conference the following week in the estate's oak-paneled hall. It was meant to be a display of confidence, a way to reframe the narrative. He rehearsed jokes meant to have a cutting edge and an apology that felt like a shield. He took the stage in a suit that seemed to have been made precisely for men who intend never to take themselves off display. He smiled, and for a moment his practiced laughter returned. But he had underestimated the power of evidence in the hands of enough patient people. Khalil and his allies had invited a notary, a legal advisor, and impartial observers. They had also asked the board of the estate to be present. When Roberto began calmly to accuse outside agitators and to ask the audience not to be swayed by sensationalism, the lawyer from Khalil's side slid a folder across the front table. It contained, in crisp order, the chain of custody documents, the lab reports, the copies of registries, and the recorded evidence of tampering attempts. The room quieted. The heir, the young man who had laughed at a boy in a corridor, was sitting near the front. He had come prepared with a smile meant to carry off scandal. As the lab director read a portion of the report aloud, the heir's smile died in the way that smiles do when they meet a mirror suddenly held up to them. He shifted in his seat. Hands that had earlier been comfortable on tabletops now folded. Roberto interrupted. His voice rose. It was the tone of someone used to an audience that agrees in advance. "This is a circus," he said. "We asked for time to review. But these are not opinions," the lab director cut in. "These are results supported by recognized methods. We offered full transparency and chain of custody." The director's voice was not accusatory. It was simply plain. In that plainness, there is a bluntness that can disarm. A journalist asked why the page had been removed from the ledger. The maintenance guard stood up and gave a measured account of how he had been approached years ago to clean up records to make room. It was not the melodrama of a confession. It was the quiet admission of a man who had been asked to be small and had tried to say no. He produced an original photocopy he had kept, one he had tucked into a drawer for years because the family had treated him well, in his own way. It showed an entry overlooked and annotated in a manner that indicated private help had been given. The weight of the accumulated evidence sat in the air like a physical thing. The heir tried to interject, to ask for a private meeting to clear this up, but a reporter had already asked the obvious question. If these findings were true, would the family consider formal recognition, reparative actions, an apology? The heir's answer was halting. In the room, the silence that filled his pauses made the laughter that had once echoed down the corridor look, in memory, an indefensible sound. What followed was less a dramatic courtroom scene and more the unglamorous work of corporate accountability. The estate's board convened an emergency session. Patricia, faced with internal memos and contemporaneous notes that suggested HR had been more concerned with appearances than fairness, was suspended pending review. Roberto, confronted with emails that showed he had suggested managing stories about a disgruntled employee and had provided funds to voices intent on smearing, was put on immediate leave. The heir was encouraged to step back from public duties while a review was undertaken. For Lourdes and Miguel, the change was quieter but immediate. The estate, seeking to move past scandal, proposed a meeting with the family. Khalil insisted on it being formal, a notary, legal representation, and a public statement. On a late morning in spring, they met in a small room with sunlight folding through the blinds. The patriarch, older now, his hair thinned, sat with hands folded. He squinted at Miguel as if trying to remember a memory that could be named. There was no theatrical confession. The patriarch's voice trembled in a way that had nothing to do with shame and everything to do with the exhaustion of a life lived with secrets. He explained, haltingly, that years ago he had given assistance to a young maid and to her child in ways that were never recorded formally. There had been conversations, informal acknowledgments, envelopes passed discreetly. He had been a man of his world, unaccustomed to official claims. "I did not foresee," he said, "that not writing what I did would hurt people later." It was not a confession of deceit so much as an admission of neglect. It could have stopped there, as a private apology. But the lab results had made it factual. The board decided, somewhat to their surprise and somewhat to the relief of those who had pushed, to take a restorative step. They agreed to formalize the relationship by granting the property that had been at the heart of Miguel's shout, bequeathed to him, or to provide equivalent restitution in a manner that would provide security. A deed, transferring the smaller, older family house near the estate to Lourdes and Miguel, along with a fund to support their education and housing needs. The details were to be handled by lawyers, and the process would include a public record. For Lourdes, the moment the notary signed was heavy and simple. It did not erase the years of grinding labor, the nights she had gone to sleep with a mouth full of ash because of bills unpaid, but it gave her a new vocabulary for the life she wanted to build. She could, at last, think of a home not as a debt and duty, but as a place where a son could read at a desk and a mother could rest without counting the hours in the washing of dishes. The estate issued a formal apology. It acknowledged the pain caused by rumors and by the way power had been used to shield reputation rather than to seek truth. Row notes and memos were archived for a public record of events. Leadership made changes. Patricia's role was re-evaluated. Roberto faced a corporate investigation into his management practices. Whether his actions would meet legal standards for criminality was left to legal processes. But his career, in the immediate aftermath, was paused. The public reaction was mixed. Some regarded the outcome as a triumph of truth, others worried about precedent. But for a child who had once been pushed into a corner, and for his mother who had folded towels in a building that never asked her name, the change was concrete. They received keys to the house, a deed that bore their names, and a packet of papers explaining how to transfer utilities and adjust taxes. It was administrative and ceremonial all at once. The larger systemic work began to coalesce around the victory. Khalil, who had watched the way institutions can be blind, proposed a program that would outlast any single board's decision. A mentorship and scholarship program targeted at children in neighborhoods like Miguel's, one that would partner with the public library and local schools. He proposed funding for extended internet access, for computers reserved for study time, and for a small renovation to the library so Miguel and other kids could have a reliable place to learn. The estate pledged to support the program as part of its restitution. Marcia organized weekend classes where Miguel would be able to teach math and geometry, his favorite subject. He did not know how he had become the sort of person who could hold a small classroom and keep attention, but he did. Kids gathered in the renovated library, and Miguel drew triangles on a whiteboard, using the same patience he had once used to write letters on the margins of a rented notebook. "Talent does not have an address," he said to them once, testing the phrase that had been circulating in conversations about him. "You don't need a house to be smart, but everyone deserves a place to put their work and a seat at a table." Lourdes found a new dignity in small, everyday things. She negotiated a contract with the estate to continue working for them in a role that recognized her decades of service with fair pay and benefits. She used some of the fund to fix the leaky roof of their apartment building and to buy a small bookshelf for Miguel. She even planted a lemon tree in a pot on their new porch, a quiet echo of the scent he had once imagined in the house, he declared. The young heir, whose laughter had once been a sound that made the world small for others, retreated from the public eye at first. There was, for him, a reckoning that came in the form of questions he had to answer at family dinners and sleepless nights. He visited a therapist, something he mentioned once and then stopped discussing, and over time, some of his edges softened. Whether he learned humility or only how to avoid being caught unkind is not the point of this story. The point is that the laughter that had once cut became, in time, a different, quieter presence in his life. Roberto, meanwhile, found himself sharply diminished in the company he had long navigated. The investigation revealed transactions that looked, on paper, like a manager using discretion to pay hush money and to redirect funds for personal advantage. The auditors found irregularities. The company fired him for cause on grounds of gross mismanagement and breach of trust. It was not a public trial in the criminal sense, but it was a fall with consequences. Yet the resolution was not merely punitive. The estate also agreed to establish a small grant in Lourdes' name to support domestic workers seeking education and to build a small archive where staff records would be kept transparently. The board realized, late and a little reluctantly, that institutional opacity had become a tool for injustice. Opening certain doors, inconvenient as it was a way to begin to repair. Weeks turned into months, and the house itself changed from object to home. It needed work. Plumbing that had been neglected in the decades when the house stood shadowed by the larger, showier rooms of the estate. Lourdes supervised repairs with a practical eye that made contractors respect her. She argued for paint choices with Miguel, who wanted a place with a desk by a window. They installed shelves and a lamp. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, their small front room smelled of lemon and paint and the particular dustiness of moved furniture. The neighborhood noticed. When Miguel left the house in the morning to teach a class in the library, kids watched him go with a new light in their faces. He had the same notebooks he always carried, but his handwriting had the steadiness of someone who now had a place to put the pages away. He continued to go to the public library, only now he brought boxes of books he had been given by a program Khalil had funded. Khalil's mentorship program took on life beyond intention. A small board of local teachers and librarians oversaw the scholarships. Teachers volunteered to lead weekend classes. The estate, doing what rich institutions sometimes can do well, provided structural funding. The program's first beneficiaries were the kids from Miguel's block. They received computer time, tutoring, and the chance to apply for small grants for school supplies. The program did not make everyone rich or solve every injustice, but it made a practical difference. A girl who had been at risk of dropping out stayed in school because a mentor helped her apply for a scholarship. A boy who had never owned a ruler learned to measure angles for carpentry work that would one day pay him. Time, in its ordinary, unremarkable way, healed some wounds and revealed others as scars. Lourdes and Miguel became public symbols for a while, invited to talk about education and dignity. They handled the attention with a kind of courteous reserve. Miguel hated being asked if he felt different now. He would say only that he felt the same in the parts of him that loved math, and a little older in the rest. One afternoon, a year after the shout at the Iron Gate, a small ceremony was held in the estate's renovated library to inaugurate the mentorship program's first completed project, an extension of the library into a volunteer study hall. Miguel was there, standing beside Marcia and the librarian. The heir attended too, quietly. He did not stand at the front. He took a seat in the back and listened. He had learned, perhaps, the humility that comes from being shown the limits of a laugh. Khalil spoke that day about the small things that can make a larger difference. He spoke of the danger of assuming that institutions, by virtue of their size, know best. He introduced the program not as charity, but as a recognition of mutual obligation, the idea that those with means have a responsibility to close gaps that systems leave wide. There was applause. There were photographs. And then, at the end, when the ceremonial ribbon was cut and kids ran in to find quiet corners, Miguel took a small chair and drew a triangle on a scrap of cardboard. He handed it to a boy who did not yet know how to measure and showed him how to use a protractor. The boy's face looked as if a door had been unlocked inside him. The house itself became, over time, less of a headline and more of a place where the ordinary rituals of life occurred. Miguel collected mail at the gate. Lords planted basil and taught neighborhood kids how to make basic soups. They hosted a weekly reading circle for neighborhood children on Saturdays. Miguel read aloud, stumbling occasionally over words, but never over meaning. He always ended with a line like, "My mother taught me to be stubborn about learning." Be stubborn about what you want to know. It was not a slogan, it was instruction. People asked Miguel sometimes whether he had forgiven those who had mocked him. Forgiveness is complicated. He said simply, "I don't know if forgiveness is a thing you reach or a thing you practice. I practice being better. That includes forgiving myself for thinking that living small was the only option." It was an answer that sounded honest and unfinished. Years later, people would tell this story in different ways. Some would remember the shout and the laugh and emphasize the DNA as if it were a miraculous key that opened a locked door. Others would remember the steady accumulation of small things: a ledger, a library photocopy, a security guard's memory. Both tellings miss the truth that mattered most: that justice required both proof and patience, that dignity was won in public but sustained in private, that a house could be a symbol of belonging or a literal shelter, but that a child's right to learn and be seen is the true inheritance. Miguel, who by then had completed high school and was starting classes at a community college, often walked past the iron gate where he had once pointed and shouted. He used his free time to tutor younger students and to travel to neighboring neighborhoods to talk about access to books. He had become, in a way his mother had always expected, a teacher. People would sometimes call him a prodigy or a symbol. He would smile politely and get back to the whiteboard. On one quiet evening, with the lemon tree rustling at the edge of their porch, Miguel stood on the threshold of the house they had reclaimed. He looked at the street that had watched him for years, then at the open door that smelled faintly of new paint and old stories. He felt, in his chest, the clear truth of a claim that had been both personal and public. "This house is mine," he said, no longer as a challenge shouted down a corridor, but as an ordinary, firm statement you make when you have the right to keep your chair at a table. Then, when lords joined him and put a hand on his shoulder, he added, "And it's ours to share." They opened the door and let neighbors in, kids with notebooks and grandmothers with stories. They served tea and spread out books. The house, for all its previous symbolism, became what houses are supposed to be: a place where people can belong, argue, learn, and rest. The city around them did not change overnight. Prejudice did not vanish like mist chased by sun. But a set of institutional choices had been made: documents preserved, records opened, a program funded, so another child would not have to count out 15-minute slots at a public library. The laugh that had once tried to make Miguel small was still sometimes heard in the mouths of people who never learned to listen. But the sound was less powerful now. Evidence had convinced enough people. Persistent care and community work convinced the rest. If you feel moved by this story, consider sharing it with someone who believes in the quiet power of education and dignity. Support your local library or a mentorship program. A small donation, time spent helping a child with homework, or even bringing books to a community center can be a doorway for someone else. The world always needs more small alliances, people who are willing to ask questions, to keep records, and to stand with those who have been told they must stay small.